What if I told you that one of the most feared walls in human history did not fall because of a war? Not because of tanks, not because of missiles, not because a powerful army smashed through it, but because ordinary people stopped being afraid. At first, that sounds impossible. After all, the Berlin Wall was not just a wall. It was a symbol, a warning, a scar through the heart of a city. For nearly 3 decades, it divided families, friends, neighbors, and a nation. It separated two worlds on opposite sides of one of the greatest political conflicts in history, the Cold War. But for the people living in Berlin, the Cold War was not just a political struggle between powerful nations. It was deeply personal. It influenced where people could live, where they could travel, and whether they could see the people they loved. Politics was not something distant happening in government buildings. It shaped everyday life. For many families, it shaped heartbreak. To millions around the world, the Berlin Wall looked permanent. It looked untouchable. It looked like something that would stand forever. Yet on a cold November night in 1989, everything changed. The question is not simply how the wall fell. The real question is why. Because walls made of concrete do not collapse on their own. Something deeper was happening beneath the surface. Something invisible. Something that had been building for years. To understand that story, we have to go back to the aftermath of World War II. In 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Its cities had been devastated by bombing. Its economy had collapsed. Millions of lives had been shattered. The war was over, but a new struggle was already beginning. The victorious powers divided Germany into occupation zones. The Soviet Union controlled the East. The United States, Britain, and France controlled the West. At first, the arrangement appeared temporary. But as tensions grew between the Soviet Union and the Western powers, Germany became the front line of a new conflict. Not a hot war, a cold one. A conflict fought through politics, ideology, influence, and fear. Soon, Germany itself split into two separate countries. West Germany embraced democracy and a market economy. East Germany became a communist state aligned with the Soviet Union. The division did not stop there. Berlin, despite being located deep inside East Germany, was also divided. West Berlin became an island of democracy surrounded by communist territory. The contrast between the two sides became impossible to ignore. In West Berlin, businesses expanded. New products filled store shelves. Living standards improved. People enjoyed greater political freedoms. In East Berlin, life was different. The government maintained tight control over society. Political dissent was dangerous. The state monitored its citizens closely. Opportunities were more limited. Many people began looking toward the West with growing envy. Year after year, hundreds of thousands left East Germany. They crossed into West Berlin and started new lives. The government watched doctors leave, engineers leave, teachers leave, students leave, young workers leave. The country was losing talented citizens. Leaders became increasingly alarmed. If the exodus continued, East Germany faced a serious crisis. Then, in August 1961, everything changed overnight. Families went to sleep in one city. They woke up in two. Barbed wire suddenly appeared across Berlin. Roads were blocked. Train routes were disrupted. Armed guards took positions. Before long, concrete barriers began rising where people had once walked freely. A wall was being built, not to keep enemies out, but to keep citizens in. What began as a desperate political solution would become one of the most famous symbols of division in modern history. For the next 28 years, it would shape millions of lives. But even the strongest walls contain the seeds of their own destruction. The Berlin Wall was no exception. As the years passed, the Berlin Wall grew into something far more intimidating than a simple barrier. The concrete itself was only part of the system. Behind it stood fences, watchtowers, floodlights, armed patrols, alarm systems, guard dogs, and a heavily monitored border zone designed to stop escape attempts before they could succeed. Many areas contained a wide, empty stretch of land between barriers. It became known as the Death Strip. The name was not an exaggeration. Anyone caught crossing it risked arrest, imprisonment, or worse. The message from the East German government was clear. Leaving was forbidden. Freedom had a border, and that border was protected by force. Yet despite the danger, people kept trying. Because there is something remarkable about human beings. The more freedom is restricted, the more valuable it becomes. Every year, East Germans searched for ways out. Some hid inside vehicles, others forged documents, some escaped through sewers. Others built tunnels beneath the wall. A few crossed rivers under the cover of darkness. Some even constructed homemade hot air balloons and flew over the border. The escape stories sounded unbelievable, yet they were real. Each successful escape inspired others. Each failure became a tragedy. Families were torn apart. Parents faced impossible choices. Friends disappeared overnight, and countless people lived with a painful question. Would they ever see their loved ones again? For many, the answer was no. The wall did not merely divide a city, it divided lives. Imagine standing only a few hundred meters from someone you loved, yet being unable to reach them. Imagine knowing they were there, knowing they could see the same sky, walk the same streets, live only minutes away, yet remain completely inaccessible. That was the reality for thousands of Berliners. Children grew into adults, separated from relatives they barely remembered. Grandparents died without seeing their families again. Entire generations learned to live with division. And still the wall stood, year after year, cold, silent, unmoving. It appeared invincible. But beneath the surface, changes were beginning. The government could stop people from crossing borders. It could not stop them from comparing realities. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, East Germans increasingly saw glimpses of life beyond the wall. Television broadcasts from the West reached many homes. News traveled through visitors and relatives. Stories crossed borders even when people could not. Citizens began noticing the growing differences. West Germany's economy expanded. Consumer goods became more available. Living standards improved. Meanwhile, East Germany struggled with economic stagnation. Shortages became more common. Opportunities felt increasingly limited. The promises made by the system no longer matched the experiences of many citizens. Doubt began spreading, quietly at first. People spoke carefully, behind closed doors, in private conversations, among trusted friends. Questions emerged. Questions that governments fear. Why are things getting worse? Why are we not free to leave? Why must a wall exist if our system is truly successful? The authorities tried to maintain control, but doubt is difficult to contain. Once people begin questioning a system, the process rarely stops. And East Germany faced another problem. The rest of Eastern Europe was changing. Political reforms were appearing. Communist governments were facing new pressures. Movements demanding greater freedom were gaining momentum. The world around East Germany was evolving. But its leaders continued acting as though nothing had changed. The wall still stood. The guards were still armed. The border was still closed. Yet something important was happening. The concrete remained strong. The system behind it was beginning to weaken, and before long, that weakness would become impossible to hide. By the late 1980s, East Germany was facing a crisis that could no longer be hidden. For decades, the government had relied on a simple formula: control information, control movement, control public opinion, control the future. For a long time, it appeared to work. But beneath the surface, frustration had been growing for years. The economy was slowing, public confidence was fading, and more people were beginning to question whether the system could survive. What made the situation especially dangerous was that dissatisfaction was no longer limited to private conversations. It was moving into the streets. Across East Germany, demonstrations began appearing. At first, they were small, a few hundred people, then a few thousand, then far more. Every week seemed to bring larger crowds, and every week seemed to bring greater courage. One of the most important centers of protest was Leipzig. There, citizens gathered regularly to demand reforms, greater freedoms, and political change. What made these demonstrations remarkable was their peaceful nature. The protesters did not arrive with weapons. They carried candles, they carried signs, they carried hope. Yet governments often fear peaceful movements more than violent ones. Violence can be portrayed as a threat. Peaceful crowds are much harder to silence. The authorities watched nervously. Security forces remained on alert. Many citizens feared a violent crackdown. History offered plenty of reasons to worry. In previous decades, similar movements elsewhere in Eastern Europe had been crushed by force. Yet week after week, people continued showing up. The crowds kept growing. The fear that had once protected the system was beginning to lose its power. Many participants understood exactly what they were risking. They could lose their jobs. They could be questioned by authorities. Some feared arrest, yet they came anyway. That growing courage became one of the strongest signs that change was approaching. At the same time, dramatic changes were unfolding beyond East Germany's borders. Across Eastern Europe, communist governments were facing increasing pressure. Reform movements gained strength. Political leaders who once appeared untouchable suddenly seemed vulnerable. Even more importantly, the Soviet Union itself was changing. Under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, new policies encouraged openness and reform. For decades, East German leaders had depended on Soviet support. Now they could no longer assume that support would always arrive. Meanwhile, another problem emerged. Thousands of East Germans discovered alternative routes to the West. Hungary began relaxing restrictions along parts of its border with Austria. Suddenly, opportunities appeared where none had existed before. Families packed their belongings. Students left. Workers left. Young people left. Every departure sent the same message. People were losing faith. The leadership found itself trapped. If it introduced reforms, it risked weakening its authority. If it refused to change, public anger would continue growing. Neither option looked safe. Inside government offices, emergency meetings became common. Officials debated solutions. Policies were revised. Announcements were prepared. Yet every response seemed too small for the scale of the crisis. The pressure continued building. Protests expanded. More citizens demanded change. More citizens demanded freedom. By autumn 1989, it was becoming clear that East Germany stood at a crossroads. Something significant was about to happen. The old rules no longer seemed reliable. The old fears no longer seemed effective. Even many loyal supporters could sense that the political ground beneath them was shifting. And the Berlin Wall, once considered permanent, suddenly looked far less certain than before. What no one realized was that the event that would trigger its collapse was only days away. And it would begin with a simple question asked during a press conference. On November 9, 1989, East Germany was under immense pressure. The government knew the situation was becoming dangerous. Protests were growing. More citizens were leaving the country. Public trust was collapsing. Leaders needed a solution, or at least something that looked like one. Officials spent days discussing new travel regulations. The goal was simple: ease public frustration without surrendering control, allow limited travel, reduce tensions, buy time. From the government's perspective, it was a carefully managed adjustment. Nothing more. No one intended to open the borders completely. No one intended to bring down the Berlin Wall. And certainly no one expected the events that would follow. That evening, government spokesman Günter Schabowski sat before a room full of journalists during a televised press conference. At first, everything seemed routine. Reporters asked questions. Officials gave answers. The atmosphere was calm, almost ordinary. Then the discussion turned to the new travel rules. Schabowski had received documents outlining the changes. But there was a problem. He had not fully reviewed all the details beforehand. Most importantly, he was unclear about when the regulations were supposed to take effect. For several minutes, the issue attracted little attention. Then a reporter asked a simple question: when will these new rules become effective? It sounded like a minor detail, a routine request for clarification. But history often changes because of details. Schabowski glanced at his papers. He searched for the answer. The room waited. Then he spoke. As far as I know, immediately. Immediately. One word, one sentence, one mistake. Within minutes, television broadcasts carried the statement across East Germany. People watching at home stared at their screens. Had they heard correctly? Immediately? Did that mean they could travel now? Did it mean they could cross the border? Did it mean the wall was effectively open? The government had not intended to send that message, but that was the message millions received. And once people believed something had changed, events began moving faster than officials could control. News spread quickly. Neighbors called neighbors. Friends called friends. Families shared the announcement. The same question echoed everywhere. Is it true? Nobody seemed completely certain, but thousands decided there was only one way to find out. They headed toward the checkpoints. At first, small groups appeared. Then larger crowds followed. Within hours, thousands of East Berlin residents were moving toward border crossings throughout the city. The atmosphere was unlike anything seen before. Excitement mixed with confusion. Hope mixed with disbelief. People laughed. People cried. People demanded answers. Some brought their passports. Others arrived carrying hope. Many feared the announcement might be reversed at any moment. That uncertainty made people move even faster. No one wanted to miss what could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. At the checkpoints, border guards faced a nightmare. They had received no clear instructions. The crowds were growing. Questions were coming from every direction. Superiors were contacted. Telephones rang continuously. Officers requested guidance. But confusion existed at every level of government. No one seemed prepared. No one knew exactly what to do. As the crowds grew, tension spread through the checkpoints. People were no longer asking quietly. They expected answers. For the first time in years, many believed the system controlling their lives might finally be changing. Meanwhile, the crowds kept growing. Thousands became tens of thousands. The pressure intensified with every passing minute. The guards stood between two choices: open the gates, or try to stop a movement that was becoming impossible to contain. As the night grew darker, the future of the Berlin Wall hung on that decision. A decision that would soon change the world forever. As midnight approached, the situation at Berlin's border crossings became increasingly chaotic. Thousands of people were already gathered. Then more arrived. And then even more. Families stood shoulder to shoulder. Friends waited anxiously together. Strangers exchanged nervous smiles. Everyone wanted the same thing: to cross, to see for themselves whether the impossible was finally happening. At checkpoints across the city, border guards faced mounting pressure. The questions never stopped. Can we pass? Is the border open? What are your orders? The problem was that the guards themselves did not know. They had received no clear instructions. Calls were made to superiors. Officials searched for answers. But the government that had spent decades controlling every aspect of public life suddenly seemed unable to control the moment unfolding before it. As the hours passed, the crowds became more confident. People began chanting. Some waved identification documents in the air. Others demanded explanations. The atmosphere remained peaceful, but the tension was enormous. Everyone understood that a single mistake could change everything. For the guards, the situation was becoming unbearable. They were trained to enforce the border. They were trained to follow orders. But now there were no useful orders to follow. Only uncertainty, only pressure, only thousands of people refusing to leave. At the Bornholmer Strasse crossing, one of the busiest checkpoints in Berlin, the situation reached a breaking point. The crowd continued growing. The noise grew louder. The demands became impossible to ignore. Then came the moment that would enter history. Faced with overwhelming pressure and no practical solution, border authorities made a decision. The gates would open. Not tomorrow, not after further review. Now, suddenly barriers were lifted. People began moving forward. Slowly at first, almost cautiously. Many could hardly believe what they were seeing. For years, crossing this border had seemed impossible. Now it was happening, right in front of them. Then the emotion became impossible to contain. People laughed. People cried. People shouted with joy. Families separated for decades embraced each other. Friends reunited. Complete strangers hugged one another in celebration. On the western side of the city, crowds gathered to welcome them. Cheers echoed through the streets. Car horns sounded endlessly. Berlin was celebrating, and the celebration quickly spread around the world. Television cameras captured every moment. Millions watched as East and West Berliners climbed onto the wall together. Some danced, some waved flags. Others simply stared in disbelief. The symbol of division that had defined an era was collapsing before their eyes. Soon, people arrived carrying hammers and chisels. Small pieces of concrete began falling away, then larger pieces. Each strike felt symbolic. Each crack represented something larger than stone. The wall had represented fear, control, division. And now those things were breaking apart. Perhaps the most remarkable part of the story is that the wall did not truly fall because of concrete. Concrete can stand for centuries. What disappeared that night was something far more important: fear. For 28 years, fear had helped keep the wall standing. Fear of punishment, fear of authority, fear of consequences. But once enough people stopped believing that fear could control them forever, the system began to collapse. The concrete remained, yet its power vanished. Within months, the Berlin Wall would be dismantled piece by piece. Within a year, Germany would move toward reunification. And before long, the Cold War itself would come to an end. A wall that once seemed eternal had fallen, not because an army destroyed it, not because a government planned it, but because ordinary people chose hope over fear. and in doing so, they changed history forever.